Thank you all for coming. John, I meant to tell you that everybody I talked to they were coming in the door, they said they were coming anyway, even if there wasn't pizza or extra credit. And so I'm glad you're here. I'm also happy to be on this campus because I have an affinity for community colleges, junior colleges, two-year colleges, because my very first real job after picking up trash on the highway for the Texas Highway Department, my first real job was teaching at a brand new community college in Dallas. This is years and years ago. Mountain View College was brand new. I was brand new. I was 23. I'd never taught a class of any kind in my life. And my students, 30 or so students who were taking English 101, it's their very first college course, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, hot like it has been here. I'm a little bit late for this first class, and they're all inside a trailer because the campus, the buildings hadn't been finished yet. So a lot of the classes were in portable trailers. So there are my students, 30 of them in there. And I'm walking to class. I'm wearing a suit and what we used to call neckties. You all remember those that we wore? I've got the required reading I want them to be aware of. And here's the trailer, and then there are these portable steps that are not connected to the trailer. So I walk up the steps, and I get 1 foot in the trailer, 1 foot still on the steps, and guess what happens? They separate. Oh, no. The English teacher falls to the ground with all of his books. And the students inside the trailer, the first thing they see of their teacher is a foot, and then they hear this explosion or something out there at the door. And I'm thinking, as I'm lying there on the ground, this is how my career begins? And then I look down, and I have split my pants. Oh, no. From here to here. And so I climb up into the classroom, and my teaching career begins. So anyway, moving past that traumatic experience, I'll take you back even farther. And maybe this will help explain why I do what I do, which is, on the one hand, I write editorials for the Chronicle about issues of the day. They're anonymous, of course. They're the Chronicle's perspective on things. The other is I travel around the state, usually visiting small towns and talking to people, learning about their history, and writing columns about those small towns. And then I write these books as well. And I think I do what I do because of my childhood experiences. I grew up in Waco. Anybody been to Waco? All right. Used to be everybody's favorite rest stop on I-35. Maybe it still is. But when I was growing up in Waco, my dad had a potato chip route, which meant that every weekday he'd get up at 5 in the morning, and he had a truck, and he would go to towns, little towns for the most part, within maybe a 50-mile radius of Waco. And in the summer or Christmas holidays, I would go with him, for company when I was a little bitty kid, and then gradually as I got bigger to help him. And I began to realize that these little towns that we visited, different ones every day, had personalities of their own. Temple was different from Killeen. Copper's Cove was different from Chilton. Cameron was different from Marlin. Kind of a weird thing for a 10-year-old to be interested in, but I was. And I still am. I still like to go to little towns, talk to people, learn about their history, learn about the sort of the particularity of those places, and then write about them. So that's how I make my living. To begin thinking about small towns, let me read you a little passage from here that's about Austin. Austin in 1885, July 4th, 1885. Austin, as you know, is not a small town now. It grows, there's a new skyscraper every day if you've been there lately. It wasn't a small town in 1885. But this sort of sets up what life was like for Texans at that time. So it's July 4th, big celebration downtown. Not only for Independence Day, but also because the Driscoll Hotel is celebrating a grand opening. The Driscoll, as you might know, is still there. It's a historic hotel. And as part of the celebration on this day, they have a local attorney anticipate or foretell what life will be like. Remember, this is 1885. What life will be like in the year 2000, July 4th, 2000. Okay? This guy's name is Shands, Edward W. Shands. This is 2000. This is what he sees. Electrical airships would be ferrying passengers from Austin to San Francisco, from thence to China and Japan, returning over Asia and Europe and across the Atlantic to home again, making a pleasure trip around the globe in a few days. Electricity would be used to send shock waves through people, causing them to live longer and end all diseases. Americans of the future would be safe not only from disease thanks to electricity, but also safe from foreign invaders. He predicted that entire armies and navies that dared attack America would be instantaneously destroyed with one electrical bolt. Every day, he's still predicting, every day 60,000 copies of the Austin Daily Statesman would be delivered through pneumatic tubes to every building in Austin. The Postal Service would be delivering the newspaper to home subscribers. Electrical airships would drop the papers upon the breakfast tables of subscribers residing hundreds of miles distant from Austin. Okay? The power of electricity. Now, flash forward, that's 1885. Flash forward 50 years, 1935. I guess we have drones that might drop the Austin American-Statesman somewhere, but it's not quite the way Shands envisioned. But if you lived outside of Austin, or Houston, or San Antonio, or Dallas, or any of the big cities, you wouldn't have electricity of any kind. You know, you're a farmer, you're a rancher, you live in a small town doing whatever, and you have coal oil lamps. And your life is hard, particularly if you're a farmer. Here's another little passage about what life was like if you happened to grow up on a farm. Anybody in here, did anybody grow up on a farm? One, two or so. Life has changed. So it's really hard if you are the farmer yourself. It's even harder if you're the farmer's wife. Imagine this. If you're a wife, you have to carry heavy buckets of water from a stream or a well. You had to haul wood. This is a description of life in the Texas Hill Country. You had to haul wood because Hill Country stoves were wood stoves. Maybe you had children to help you, but more than likely, you're the one who cooked on that stove, who had to get the fire going and keep it going. You had to start every meal from scratch because there were no electric refrigerators to keep ingredients fresh. You had to cook 3 meals a day. Not just for your family, but at certain times of the year for a 20 or 30 person harvesting crew. You would have to, in the summertime, you'd have to can, preserve fruits and vegetables in a hot kitchen over a hot stove. And then once a week there was wash day, not putting clothes in the washing machine, but boiling 3 wash tubs of water outside, water that had been carried near the house from the well or the stream. A hill country farm wife had to do her chores day after day, year after year. She got sick. It's too bad. And somebody had to look after the kids as well. There's a fellow named Robert Caro who has written about life in the hill country in his biography of Lyndon Johnson. He said, the one almost universal characteristic of the women was that they were worn out before their time, that they were old beyond their years, old at 40, old at 35, bent and stooped and tired, mainly because they had no electricity. They had no electricity because the power companies that served the towns and the cities saw no benefit in running power lines out into the countryside where there were maybe 2 or 3 people living on farms every mile. It wasn't cost effective. So every year probably in these small towns, not only in the hill country but all over Texas, farmers would, they put on their one white starched shirt, starched by you-know-who, their clean khakis, and they would go into town and they would talk to the power company executive, begging that the company string lines out into the countryside so their lives could be modern. This is 1935, not 1885. And the executive would sit there and listen and then respond in an infuriating, condescending way, something to the effect, we're not a charity, we're a business. We can't make any money running power lines out into the countryside. So they go back home and they milk the cow and they do things that farm life requires. They finally, rural Texans, finally figured out a way to get power to their farms and to their ranches and to their small towns. And it comes in the midst of the Depression when the whole country is in trouble. And it comes with the Roosevelt administration looking for anything they can do to get the country back on its feet. And one thing they can do, or the one thing the administration decided to do, is to create something called the Rural Electrification Association, REA. And what this organization did was make loans to small farmers, small town Americans, so that they could have the resources to get power out into the countryside. In other words, they could bypass the investor-owned utilities or the city-owned utilities and set up power companies of their own. They relied on what sometimes overlooked. The farmers were relying on something that's sometimes overlooked, and that's called cooperation. They had to cooperate among themselves to qualify for this new government effort to bring power to the country. So to make it work, though, people who wanted electricity to come to their farms or to their ranches had to sign up. You had to get enough of them to make it worth even an electric cooperative's benefit. And to do that, the REA would look for people in the neighborhood or living in the countryside that they call ramrods, R-A-M-R-O-D-S. I mean, these are not, they didn't have a job where they were ramrods, but they were leaders in their community. And what they would do is get in their car and drive from one farm to another saying, look, $5, that's all it'll take. If you'll sign up, if enough of you will sign up, we will have power in the country, in the countryside. I came across the story of a woman in a little town. If you drive 250 miles from here, straight north, you come to a little town called Douglasville in the Piney Woods. And back in the 30s, when these little towns were trying to create cooperatives, she took it upon herself to be the ramrod for her county and the adjoining county. Her name was Mabel Douglas, and she was married to a man named J.C. I'm sorry, I called her Mabel Douglas. She lives in Douglasville, but her name is Mabel Morris. Her husband is J.C. Morris, although nobody calls him J.C., they call him Po' Boy, because that's what he called himself. Po' Boy had an auction barn in Douglasville, and he would auction off anything and everything. If you had a piece of junk, take it to Po' Boy, and he will auction it off for you. He also auctioned off horses and mules and donkeys and maybe 750 cattle a day. And his wife Mabel would help him run the auction barn when she wasn't overseeing the Dewdrop Inn, her cafe across the road from the auction barn. She also taught Sunday school. She raised 2 kids. She organized the county's first health clinic. So she was the archetypal ramrod, a person who got things done. So she took it upon herself to bring electricity to that part of Northeast Texas. What that meant for her to do, first of all, was to start writing letters to Washington saying, we need electricity. We are eligible for this REA cooperative program. Let us have a co-op here in this area. Then she would take the train, probably from Texarkana to D.C., and she would knock on doors of congressmen and Roosevelt administration people. They got tired of dealing with Mabel Morris. And finally they said, okay, you can have a co-op. But that wasn't the only thing she had to do. She still had to get enough of her neighbors to sign up. So she would get in her car, in her Model T, drive through those dirt roads, red dirt roads through the pine trees, knocking on doors. And farmers were apprehensive. You know, they weren't sure what would happen when if you had electricity in your home, you pull that wire from the bulb in the ceiling of the living room, you know, maybe the house would catch on fire. You got to fill out all this paperwork. They're suspicious of the government. Finally, Mabel Morris persuaded enough of her neighbors to sign up that they got a co-op and they got electricity. So she was, this is in 1939 when electricity finally came to Douglasville and environs. She became the first secretary-treasurer of the co-op. She served from 1939 until her retirement in 1978. At the same time, she kept the books for Po' Boy's auction house. As I said, she raised kids. She tended an orchard and a 150-bush rose garden, helped out at Po' Boy's general store in addition to the auction barn, and taught Sunday school for 60 years. Oh, and she also served on the city council and as mayor from 1958 to 1981. And finally she said, no more, I'm not running again. So they had the mayoral election and she won in a landslide by write-in vote. She's 85 and she's the mayor yet again. Finally she said, okay, one more time, this is it. And so that was the end of her career after that last term. So that was in the mid-1980s when she finally ended her political tenure in Douglasville, Texas. It was about the same time that I started writing about small towns in Texas. Towns like Canadian in the Panhandle and Dumas, and we were talking about New Waverly. New Waverly was one of those towns back before it became a bedroom community of Huntsville and Houston. Towns all over the state. My mother is from the town of Bigfoot. Has nothing to do with Sasquatch, but that's where she grew up. She was the valedictorian of the Bigfoot High School class of 1932. So there are stories in these little towns. But what I began to realize, as you all probably know, whenever you get off the interstate, a lot of these little towns are nearly gone. They're drying up. They're disappearing. If they're not within sort of the reach of, say, Austin or Houston, they're not in the hill country, then they're in bad shape. They're lucky if they're a county seat. You'll drive into a little town, and there's this majestic courthouse on a square, but the brick buildings all around it are either empty or there's some kind of junk shop, antique shop spelled Antike or something like that, and that's about it. It's really depressing. What I began to notice, though, is that in many of these small towns, the one thriving business is a Mexican food cafe, usually run by multi-generations of a family, grandparents, parents, and kids, usually open for 16 hours a day, people working their tails off to make it in this country. So I was thinking about those towns, the ones that are dried up, the ones that are thriving. One morning when I was driving to a small town called LaGrange. Y'all know LaGrange? It's a nice town, close to Austin. It's one of those that's doing well, partly because it's close to Austin, but mainly because it has taken care of its German Czech heritage, architecturally and otherwise. It's a nice place. And I was thinking not only about small towns, but I was thinking about how for 40 years, I'm going to make a leap here, but so hang on with me. For about 40 years, I've been writing editorials about immigration reform. You see how well I've done, how influential I've been. Same as my 40 years of editorials on gun safety. So I'm driving along thinking about immigration, thinking about, is there some other way to write about immigration that I haven't written about it over the past 40 years? And as I'm pulling into LaGrange, I got to thinking, what if there's a connection? What if there's a connection between small towns that need help and our immigration system, which desperately needs help as well? What if we somehow worked on that system so that we could find and welcome newcomers willing to move into these once thriving small towns and bring them back to life? What if we offered them incentives? I'm talking about immigrants now. What if we offered them incentives to start businesses in those abandoned buildings, started agricultural enterprises? What if they worked from home? What if they fixed up old buildings? What if they revived schools and churches in these little towns like Paducah and other small, dying Texas towns? It's not just Texas. I drove the other day to Kansas, up straight through Oklahoma. Their small towns are dying as well. Immigrants fleeing war, violence, economic hardship, a lot of times have professional skills. What if they're the ones helping us staff struggling rural hospitals? What if they help us teach languages in rural public schools? We can use these people, it seems to me. Maybe what I'm saying is that maybe immigrants could help us save small towns in Texas. And then I thought of a precedent. This would be your 2-paragraph history lesson. 1862, the Homestead Act was passed. And the Homestead Act did more than anything you can think of to accelerate the settlement of Western states. You know, those open prairies, the plains, empty, until the Homestead Act encouraged people to come out and start new lives. Thanks to the Homestead Act, you could, if you were an adult head of a family, you could have 160 acres of surveyed public land for a minimal fee if you agreed to live on that land and make it work, agriculturally or wherever, for 5 years. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law in the midst of the Civil War. It's been called one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of the United States. And then, you know, when you think about it, our whole nation is something of an unofficial Homestead Act. The U.S. didn't exist until immigrants arrived with hopes, dreams, willingness to work. You know, that reminds me, I was thinking of those people who come to this country not knowing the language necessarily, but have the bravery, for lack of a better word, to start a business. If you moved to Mexico, would you know how to start a business, not knowing the language? I wouldn't. I'd be terrified. I'd never even consider it. But newcomers did that then and do that now. You and I live in a state that didn't exist until Mexico opened the region to Stephen F. Austin and the other colonizers. The incentive for those people who came was land, lots of it. And they made lives for themselves on that land. Many of them came with the colonizers, with Stephen F. Austin and others, but a lot of them just came. They were illegal aliens to Mexico, and they made this state. LaGrange, that town I mentioned where I was going, it did not exist until German and Czech immigrants arrived in the 1850s and set into building, and it's still thriving. Immigrants arrived at the port of New Orleans, Galveston, Indianola, Ellis Island. They were as poor and as desperate as the men, women, and children today who have traveled for months through dangerous Central America and Mexico to the Rio Grande. Those earlier immigrants transformed a nation. Couldn't their counterparts, or their modern day counterparts, with our encouragement, also contribute? Keep in mind that I'm not advocating people having to swim the Rio Grande or wade the Rio Grande. I'm not advocating illegal immigration. What I am advocating are programs that encourage people to get here and opportunities for them to get here legally. Interestingly enough to me, I found out that there are states in this country that are doing that very thing, not Texas. The ones that are doing it, often without much attention, are ignoring the decades-long deadlock in Washington and are creating programs and incentives to welcome immigrants, help them integrate into communities, and get them settled in their new towns, and take advantage of their skills, their talents, their drive, just as this country's been doing for centuries. In Texas, Houston and Dallas and San Antonio do what they can to welcome immigrants, but they're fighting state government and to some extent the federal government's confusion and dysfunction. But these other states that I found were surprising in that the very first one I talked to was Utah. Utah is a Republican state, and yet they do more. That state does more to welcome immigrants than any other state that I came across. And maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. If any of you are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you know that Mormons are accustomed to going overseas on missionary visits. They're accustomed to being around people who aren't necessarily like them. And so they were happy to welcome people to Utah, and not just welcome them, but help them get settled, learn the language, figure out the licensing procedure to start a business. And they're doing it in large part because there's a reciprocal benefit. It's helping Utah. One of the government officials in Utah I talked to told me that in the fall of 2022, Utah had 125,000 job openings, and they had 45,000 unemployed people. 125, 45. Immigrants were helping fill those openings. It wasn't just Utah's. Ohio, Iowa, New York State, all are doing things to benefit not only newcomers, but themselves as well. The Utah governor who started the program, Spencer Cox, who's still in office, calls it the New Americans Initiative. And it's still working. And what they're trying to do is make Utah a welcoming place for newcomers. Again, we're talking about legal immigration, and we're talking about making this country a better place. Some of these, as in Utah, some of the people who have started these programs are Republicans. Some of them are Democrats. Obviously, they can't, by themselves, untangle a knotted up, inefficient federal immigration system. But they seem to be implementing smart, creative efforts to detour around the deadlock, to meet local needs, and to live up to our own history as a nation of immigrants. Utah's doing it. Iowa's doing it. Why not Texas? Why can't we be, thinking of the Statue of Liberty, why can't we be a lamp? Why can't we be a golden door, a distant dream across this narrow river that separates us from Mexico? So that's that's sort of our history journalism lesson this morning. I thought, just for the fun of it, I would tell you one more story from the Native Texan book. I'll tell you 3/4 of the story so that you'll be encouraged to buy the book, okay? Has nothing to do with immigration. So when my dad was growing up in Central Texas on a farm, he didn't get along with his dad. I knew that he was my grandfather. He was not a likable fellow. So my dad, when he was 15 or 16, would get in a fight with his dad, and he would leave. He would run away from home, and he would hop freight trains. You know what that means, right? You climb on top of a boxcar, and he would head west to San Angelo. He had an uncle out there, Uncle Joe, who was known as Big Joe in San Angelo because he was 6'4" and weighed 300 pounds and wore a white suit everywhere he went. And so people would see him on the streets of San Angelo, "Hey, Big Joe," and so forth. He was also a bootlegger and a gambler. That's how he made his living. This is you know, there's no liquor around. So Uncle Joe made a good living. And my dad would go out there and stay with him for a long time. Uncle Joe said, "You know, I could set you up out here, son, but your mom would never," you know, his sister, "your mom would never forgive me." So that was my dad's experience in San Angelo with Uncle Joe. Years and years later, when my dad was in his early 90s and he was losing his memory, I took him to San Angelo to see if, you know, by driving around familiar places, I could sort of revive some of those stories in his mind that he had told me. Stories about going with Uncle Joe in his Model T around town. Uncle Joe was so big that he had taken the springs out from under the seat so he could get under the steering wheel. My dad would sit there like a kid with his feet straight out until he realized he had to take a pillow with him. And they would go collect rent from rent houses he owned in partnership with a woman named Hattie, Miss Hattie. Miss Hattie had not only rent houses with Uncle Joe, but she also had the most popular bordello, brothel, in downtown San Angelo. San Angelo had an army fort, Fort Concho, so there was a lot of business for Miss Hattie downtown at Miss Hattie's Parlor, as it was known. So when my dad and I were driving around San Angelo, we happened to notice a bordello museum on Concho Street, the main street of San Angelo, called Miss Hattie's Parlor Museum. So, you know, we bought our tickets at the jewelry store next door, and to get to the museum, you have to climb these stairs. The stairs begin at the sidewalk and go straight up, really, really steep, really narrow, one landing. So here's my dad and I, you know, he's 93 or 94. We're walking up the stairs. You get up there, and there's a hallway where each of the young women who worked for Miss Hattie would have their own little room. There would be a screen door, and then inside would be their particular room. And then there, where the stairs come up, you know, it's kind of a square-shaped area. And we're up there looking around. There are things on the wall. There are photographs. There's an application form for Miss Hattie's Parlor. And I'm looking at photos on the wall. You know, like I'm standing there looking at photos there, hoping I might see a picture of Uncle Joe or my dad. And I didn't, but as I'm standing there like this, and he's back over here looking at photos on the wall, I hear this horrible clatter. And I realized that my dad, at age 93, he's standing like this. He backs up, not realizing that the stairs are right there. I noticed a connection between my own experience as a teacher and now my dad. He falls backward down these stairs. And I realized that as I'm running over there, that I've killed my dad in a bordello. So the rest of the story's in the book. You can find out what happened. Thank you all for coming.